is why you are here with us. And it is in this sense that we have invited our colleagues, Marina Sandes and Thiago Canetieri, who will be critical rapporteurs on the seminar as external observers of our discussions. I also thank my partners in the organizing committee, Professors Daniel Medeiro de Freitas, Jerusa Lustosa, and the PhD students Bruno Fernandes and Tarciso Contígio Cunha, and also in the MSc program, Renata Salles, and undergrads, Barbara Hoffman, Gabriela Sevilla, and Fabrício Ferreira. And finally, all of the Praxis researchers who are taking part here. Our group was born in 2009, and it was registered in the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, CNPq, and in the Department of Projects in the Department of Architecture of UFMG under my coordination, supported initially by two undergrad students, Thais Nassif and Pedro Schuf, who we cannot fail to thank now. Since 2016, Professor Daniel Medeiro de Freitas has accompanied me in the coordination of the group too, and so I owe to him these last thanks. Over these years, we have developed teaching, research, and outreach projects funded and supported by different entities and partnerships with residents from various different parts of the metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte. Social movements, researcher networks from several national and international universities. On the one hand, we cannot fail to register that we have gone through drastic budget cuts and political attacks that the universities have suffered from this current government. On the other hand, we will continue to work in a very strong and cooperative way through teaching, research, and outreach in search of critical education, production, development, broadcasting, and application of knowledge that is coherent with the social, cultural, political, environmental, technological, territorial, and economic conditions experienced by our society, and give answers to the needs posited by its citizens, alongside UFMG's professors, students, and employees. In the Praxis group, we have an assumption that the urban space is a structured and structuring medium that brings about a set of information, social, economic, cultural, territorial, environmental, technical, and political. And this set of information is presented through the practices of individuals who act and react in cities. Therefore, the practices are sourced from the structural features of the society and the strategies that are activated when stakeholders make choices, make decisions, or fight for individual and collective interests. Thus, we embrace one of our main theoretical references, Pierre Bourdieu. The group's work is also guided by a critical perspective on power relations that structure the practices of urban space production, the determinations from the social, economic, political, cultural, environmental, and institutional fields, and also in terms of the model of neoliberal cities and the instruments and mechanisms of analysis, representation, and interventions in cities. Over the years, we have been present in popular territories. These are places that are built by their own residents and identified by contrasting characteristics and significant ruptures in comparison to the institutional urban state. In this direction, we carry out theoretical, methodological, and empirical connections to the questions concerning the production of urban space through transdisciplinary dimensions, which enables us to learn about what we do not yet know. In response to these research axes, who controls the city? Who benefits what? From what? Who is oppressed or violated by the city? And how is this supported by which practices? With this seminar, we intend to advance in the expertise of our research group and also to further the assumptions of our teaching, research, and outreach practices carried out over the last 13 years. You will notice that this seminar is a bit delayed in time because of the pandemic, but we also want to launch other theoretical and methodological views upon the production of the contemporary urban studies and to share updated results and the development of our actions. Our goals, we recognize, are broad, but we want to we will be able to notice them here because we want to provoke ruptures in the current institutional, technical, and academic narratives that are mainstream and that are present in the contemporary political and institutional arena, making the experimentation of other possible arrangements possible. We also want to understand popular territories, especially from the perspective of those who inhabit them. We want to promote the rise of popular knowledge and social emancipation of citizens in the process of production of the city through horizontality and communicative relations and the shared practices of reading and production of the urban spaces and constructive knowledge. We also want to strengthen the network between the three pillars of the university: research, teaching, and outreach. We want to build research through transdisciplinary dialogue. And we want to promote the debate between social groups, academia, and the government in the construction of public policies. I thank all of those of you who are willing to jointly build this event and everyone who is listening to us. And I thank everyone. Have a great seminar, and I give the floor to Professor Danielle. Thank you, Denise. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the...
My name is Danielle. I am a professor in the Humanism Department. I'm going to make a longer presentation on the day that I present here in the seminar. I believe it's on May 9th. And now I'd just like to give you some information on the event. The seminar will take place, as Estevam mentioned, in 7 sessions starting today, always on Mondays at 2 p.m. at Brasilia time, and will end in the May 16th. It's an online event, webinars open to the public, and you can participate through the YouTube chat. The complete program of the webinar is available at our website, Praxis +10, and we'll have the link on YouTube, and also you can also see it on our social media. After the seminar, the idea is that we'll have an ebook with all of the works that were presented here, and we will do this for the 13th birthday of Praxis. On our first day, we'll have 2 seminars, one from Professor Amir Ozman and another one from Professor Ricardo Estevam. I'm going to present them briefly, and then I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Ozman, and then Professor Ozman is a Sudanese architecture professor at Trent University of Technology and Research of Special Transformation in South Africa. She is a PhD in architecture at the University of Pretoria and has vast experience in curating international architecture events such as Kuya 2014, which took place in Dublin. Professor Ozman's work reinforces that architects have a critical role to perform in taking over built environments to create cities that are just, pleasant. Ricardo is a professor in the Javerian University of Bogota. He is the author of Decolonizing Democracy, and he's also the editor of another book. Each seminar has we foresee that they will take 30 minutes and then we'll have the debate. You can send your questions in the chat. And if you want to receive the certificate, you can fill in the form. And this link will also be available on the YouTube chat. Now I'd like to open the floor to Professor Amir Ozman. And I'd like to thank her for her presence here on our webinar. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Professor Ozman.
Thank you so much for the invitation, for the seminar, or the seminar series, which seems to be an incredibly exciting opportunity. And it's a huge honor to be here. Listening to the introductions and listening to Denise, it's incredible how we share similar concerns around cities, around opportunities and access to cities. And I think we speak the same language, despite the fact that we speak different languages. I would like to share my presentation. And I hope that it is clear now. So I will be speaking on a multidimensional understanding of transformation. As was mentioned now, I currently hold the position of chair in spatial transformation, positive change in a built environment. Since I've taken on this position, I've reflected a lot on what the word transformation means, and I will be looking at this multidimensional understanding of the term through my teaching, research, and practice in the very divided cities in South Africa. I also just following up again on what Prof. Denise Morado said initially, we often look to Brazil, and we still do, Denise, despite all of the difficulties that Brazil and other regions of the world are going through. I think Brazil still remains an inspiration for us in terms of understanding cities. So I am starting, and I am so sorry, there seems to be a problem. Okay. So space has power, space is political, space is not neutral, space has meaning. Space tells us, are we valued, are we important, and do we count? So in that way, space can exclude, humiliate, intimidate, and anger. And one of my favorite quotes that I often use is, create inhumane environments and people will respond likewise. I've therefore often asked the question, what does transformation look like? This question has led to more critical questions, such as what does equity, dignity, and inclusion look like? And I believe it's our work as built environment professionals to translate these concepts into space and form through using tools such as spatial articulation, density, regulatory frameworks, etc., to achieve the required change. And there's no way to achieve this without political buy-in. laws, and this is, South Africa is living evidence of this, is that laws are often passed to uphold structures that serve the intentions of the ruling powers at any given time, and they're a reflection of the value systems that underpin them. And many of these laws relate to the built environment. And if we want to realize alternative visions around cities, we need to have different laws. So governance and political buy-in is incredibly important. And my argument is that this alternative vision for cities needs to be powerful, inspiring, and implementable. Implementable is very important here. And it needs to translate into tangible and felt realities in the daily lives of people. There's a little bit of a time lag when I try to change my slides, but I'll be patient and hopefully it goes smoothly. In this new vision, people collectively inhabit the city, benefiting from the opportunities it has to offer, irrespective of income level. And as an alternative to current modes of decision-making in cities, this alternative approach will ensure that diverse voices are included through the financial and technical mechanisms we adopt for design decision-making. This vision caters for all the invisible and the hidden factors that make up the city. Many cities need to transform in order to be more equitable, sustainable, and to function better. But I don't believe there's a sufficient understanding of transformation and how its concepts might be translated into practice. So what I'm presenting today is an understanding of transformation as both the transformation of the built environment professions, as well as the spatial transformation of cities. So by making this distinction, I'm looking at it as a multidimensional aspect where I then study the transformation through teaching, research, and practice, as well as the transformation of the profile of what makes up or constitutes the architectural community. So I think this can be global, but please do bear in mind that a lot of what I say is based on my experience in South Africa. So, and I think Denise, Prof. Denise did make reference to this, that the relationship between our professions, our disciplines, the communities, and the regulatory bodies is significant in determining the effectiveness of these disciplines. How professions are regulated and how the membership of those professions is constituted plays a major role in guiding practice. So I just wanted, and this slide is almost like a disclaimer. What I'm saying is that I do understand there are many, many complexities. So this perspective does not ignore other important factors to achieve spatial integration. We need strategic government investment, we need targeted research funding, all of that is important. But what I'm very deliberately trying to do, despite the fact that I understand that there's a need for complex and multi-level or multidisciplinary interventions, yet my argument is that the architecture profession still has a major role to play. And this is a deliberate attempt to focus the light on the profession and in a way hold it accountable for the inequities we face in cities. So despite all of the possibilities that the built environment professions have to contribute to spatial transformation, the arguments are, and I'm referring mostly to arguments here in South Africa, where technocrats were trained in designing and delivering the built environment, and we don't want to be too political. This is something that's often said. And yet all professions operate in a political space, and that space has been created through politics, and there's no escaping that reality. So historically, technical and spatial design interventions have been used to deepen divisions. And technical and spatial design decisions are value-laden, they are never neutral. And the technical and spatial design decisions are a reflection of our beliefs about rights and access to the city and the opportunities it's a reflection of what we believe about poverty, about the poor and the place of the poor in the city. So it's incredibly important to take these aspects into consideration. I'm sorry about the time lag. I don't want to make any changes to the presentation in case it gives me more problems, but there's a little bit of a time lag. So the architecture profession has a major role to play in avoiding othering. And the architecture profession can offer both spatial, technical, and social expertise. And it can play a major role in stitching cities together, but it many times remains uninvolved and disengaged. It's an elitist profession. I think we have to admit that. And what my argument is that by employing relevant strategies in research, teaching, and practice, we can achieve professional transformation and then ultimately realize spatial transformation. Now, you might say this is a blog that I wrote a few years ago. It was after the death of Zaha Hadid, and a lot of what I'm saying can be found on my various websites. This is the website of a course that I presented at the University of Johannesburg some years ago, and it was titled The Controversy Around Zaha. And here I'm making reference to Zaha Hadid and after her death. It's quite a long blog, but I've just extracted some parts of it to further strengthen my argument. So there's a section in the blog where I've titled it A Critique of the Profession and the Very Institutions Conferring the Awards. And I'm just going to read from these extracts. The assumption that I, as a female architect, as was implied by some articles after Zaha Hadid's death, the assumption that I would aspire to break the glass ceilings in the kind of environment that she operated in is something of an insult. As a woman architect, I aspire to change the profession completely so that young women architects are inspired to question this particular interpretation of what architecture is and what the rise to the top means. The reality is that we are questioning our profession, practice, and relevance. We are questioning the very institutes that confer the awards and the criteria that they use. I'm hoping that the delay at least gives the translator a chance to translate. Okay, wonderful. There's definitely a time lag. So again, this is continuing an extract from the blog, and here this quote is referring to Al Jazeera's rebel architects. I hope some of you are aware of it. This quote goes, "The tone of architecture culture has changed in only a few years. The heady days of the 2000s, architects were in furious competition to produce iconic buildings for a global market. Virtuosi such as Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, and Norman Foster kept the media fed with fabulous images of museums and corporate headquarters, earning the moniker Starchitects. But after the financial crash of 2008, it became clear that the social value of so much that Starchitecture was nil, that the social value of so much of Starchitecture was nil, and there was a correction, to borrow a financial or a market term, in the architect's image. So again, continuing from the same blog, a critique of the profession, the irony is that the same Euro-centered, male-dominated profession is now entering the arena of poverty, informality, and disadvantage with the same kind of big attitudes and big thinking practiced in the rest of the profession. So we are now having to deal with celebrity slums, as someone referred to Kibera in Nairobi, and the celebrity architects that have now made these slums their new playgrounds. But that's a topic, I say this in the blog and I say it now, that's a topic for another forum and another time. But I think this extract explains my thinking around a critique of the profession. As built environment professionals and as architects, we need to offer direction. And I think, again, Prof. Morado did mention this around collaborations between the different entities that make up the city. We must be able to inspire individuals, communities, government, policy and decision-making agencies to adopt alternative visions. And we do this through our research, teaching and practice. And that brings us to the 3 dimensions of transformation that I'll take you through. So in my teaching, and I consider that all of my teaching is an experiment, it's an ongoing experiment, and it's been ongoing for over 30 years, starting off in Khartoum in Sudan, my hometown, and continuing in various institutions in South Africa. And my teaching revolves around the themes of housing and urban environments. I list here the development of this research field, housing and urban environments, and there's a website for HUE, which some of the audience might like to look at after the presentation. But this just lists the years where I've developed this particular approach to teaching. And I've documented also in a chapter in a book called Educating Citizen Designers in South Africa, and it was published in 2018. And again, I'm reading a few extracts from that book. My design teaching practice has focused on instilling the values of citizenship and design activism by emphasizing the belief that design can make a difference and serve a higher purpose. I've done this by tapping into the unique skills of architects, but also borrowing from other disciplines. And as the people, the 3 people now that have introduced these seminars, this focus on working across disciplines is incredibly crucial, I think, for us to be effective. In my courses, architecture is presented as a social act based on social agreements, serving the needs of the individual as well as the collective and helping to manage the relationship between them. And I premise my pedagogical approach on these concepts, and I try to enable my students and our partner communities to achieve more awareness of their agency, influence, and decision-making capacity in the built environment. Activism in my projects is in the form of service learning and providing documentation and design and building services to the communities that we work with. And I know that this is very much in line with some of or a lot of the work that is being done by our partners in Brazil as well. So there's something that over the years, it's incredibly important to me. When I first started drafting my research proposals, I always used the term knowledge transfer. And as the years went on, I realized how arrogant that was. And I changed that in all of my documentation, all of my communications to knowledge exchange. So this for me has been an important transition in my career, that understanding once we go out and work with communities that we are servicing, there's incredible knowledge there that needs to be acknowledged and captured within the academic realm as well. So this change in terminology has been important to me. So over the years, and here I'm just giving a few examples, the idea of interface, a building, and this is very different from the way that I was trained in the 80s in Khartoum, and I think a lot of people were trained where a building was an object within the confines of a site. It was a beautiful object. It related very little to the surroundings. And this idea of buildings creating an interface with the city, relating in particular ways to the city, influencing through their form, spatially, scale-wise, and programmatically. Buildings then create these interfaces in cities that become very important. So over the years, I've looked and worked with my students and with my collaborators on trying to translate various concepts into images and into space and into design. But it's always, this is the work of, all of this is work from various student projects. This particular student not only looked at the form making of a building, but also looking at who owns what and how relationships are managed in a built environment. The idea of street edge activation is incredibly important in all of the work that I do with my students, and that again relates to this concept of the interface. We've actually tried to motivate a lot for the implementation of a wall tax in order to avoid having walls in our cities, but rather to have active street edges where these walls become multifunctional and provide an ideal location for social government subsidized rental housing, as well as other social and commercial functions. One of the things we've done recently is we've built a custom-made trailer, fitted it out with battery-powered tools, and we go out into communities and work with, the intention is that trailer will then be used in these projects where we go out, we co-design, and we actually implement some of these projects. And again, that is captured in the HUE website, and I hope some of you will be able to visit it. This is some of the community work that we do. So in terms of research, as I was writing this text for this particular seminar, I started reflecting on all of the research I've done over the years, and I thought it's evolved a lot, but it's actually remained also, my concerns have remained very similar over the years. I've been concerned with the relevance of the profession to the contexts in which I practice for many years. And my very first paper, and if I remember correctly, I think I was about 23, 24 years old, was titled The Role of Architects in African Countries. My latest published contribution in the general media in 2021 is Crisis as an Opportunity to Heal South Africa's Divisive Spatial Geographies. And prior to that, in 2015, I wrote What Architects Must Learn from South African Student Protests. Ricardo and Denise were both participants in this project where we produced a book, the first in a series, a book series, The Built Environment in Emerging Economies. And the title of my contribution was We Hear You, the Unheard, Marginalized and Excluded, Power and Cities. And then more and more over the years, my research efforts have focused on how to use community engagement as a mechanism to investigate and deepen our knowledge about practice. So one of the things that really bothers me, and I try to focus on this in all of my research endeavors, is that we have the tendency to look at cities using this view, a bird's eye view, an aerial view. This is a view of Warwick Junction in Durban in South Africa. This is the view of my own hometown, Khartoum, and these are the Nile rivers. And we tend to look at cities through that view. And oftentimes we neglect the small person on the street, the small local activities. This is an image of a tea lady, thousands of them in Sudan. Mostly operating along the River Niles, the various river banks. And the other image is an image I took in Kigali, in Rwanda, showing the local transport systems and just a pedestrian with the shimmering Kigali skyline in the background. But we tend to forget these activities on the road, on the streets, the pedestrians, the relationship of the buildings to the streets, and focus more on these very grand gestures, if I may call them that. So I have this multi-year integrated research and teaching project, and Prof. Morado will know that my focus is very much based on looking at the world through an open building lens, and I hope some of you will know open building as a way of designing thinking and looking at it in terms of its relevance to South Africa, looking at alternatives to current housing strategies, rethinking the processes and the products of what we do, teaching beyond the design studio, and always local knowledge informing design, where the city serves as our laboratory. So these are documents that are again available online, where we look at existing projects and critique them. And this particular one was done in 2011, but it's a process that we very much continue doing, where we look at how we can change the way that we design buildings in the city to make them a lot more relevant and for them to last, to have much longer lifetimes, if I may call it that way. So these are some of the kind of analysis that we do as part of my research activities, and they're all related to this idea of open building. And a lot of this, and I think, again, Prof. Morado made reference to the fact that we can't operate in isolation. All of this work that we do, what I try to do is I try to publish it in public media. This is a podcast that I have. I've made reference to this particular article, but I make very deliberate attempts to take this research out into the public arena. So that leads us to the third aspect and the final aspect of practice. And I believe that we may practice with a view to achieve transformation in every project, however small or isolated it is. We can achieve a transformational aspect in it. And what I'll show here is a few project examples on how to implement this principle. But I believe that every project presents an opportunity for transformational practice. Now, what some will argue, and it's happened to me a lot, is that we operate at site level. We can't really make that much change or contribute to policy change, but I believe we can, through buildings, really operate in transformational ways. So what I present here is that professions may move beyond the limitations of only servicing the wealthy minority by bringing an aspect of inclusivity to every project. Now, even if you're serving a wealthy client, it can be through skills development opportunities, the inclusion of small builders, the use of local suppliers, as an example. And indeed, what I say is that the smallest or the largest project can be conceptualized, designed, and implemented to be highly transformational. And that professional institutes, councils, and authorities need to become involved in this transformational process in a very concerted and deliberate and targeted manner. I have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap up as best as I can. Thank you. Thanks, Denise. So my design approach conceptualizes objects from a long-term perspective. I've made reference already a couple of times to open building, and I've just listed here concepts that relate to open building in case some of them have resonance to some of the audience. The fourth dimension in design, time-based design, disentanglement, open building, system separation, level thinking, distributed decision-making, etc. So all of that looks at buildings from a long-term perspective and relevance for their various inhabitants over their lifetime. So I believe that disentanglement presents many benefits. And when I talk about including the small scale builder, the small scale emerging builders, emerging construction companies, unskilled labor, by disentangling our buildings, by having system separation of buildings, we're able to do that. And that's why in the lifetime and in the operational, in the construction and in the lifetime and operational phase of the buildings, this has incredible benefit. Open building means that buildings can change in use. They can be reused, either the whole building or components of the building. It allows us to future-proof our urban environments. It allows us, one very key aspect is that it allows us to include informal activities, and the more frequent change and the very dynamic needs of the inhabitants of cities can be accommodated for if we use this approach of disentanglement, open building, and future-proofing. So these are concepts that I'd like to add to this argument. And what I do through a lot of my writing and teaching and practice is that I believe that every project is an opportunity to contribute to restructuring. It's a new paradigm, it's an alternative, but ultimately, if adopted widely, it can really help reconceptualize the whole housing sector. And it can be applied at building, neighborhood, and city levels. And I'll just read the last segment there. The differentiation between the primary and secondary levels of the environment allows for the accommodation of informal processes, the involvement of small-scale builders and small local industries in the fit-out infill levels, and for the ongoing participation by residents and users. That's my half hour that I'm wrapping up. So these are some projects that I have been involved in over the years, where you'll see some of the principles around interface, relationship with the street, the buildings making space, but also like simple things like a model that our community collaborators could pull apart and help us make decisions about those contexts. Again, some projects I've been involved in, and the kind of documentation that we produce just in the initial phases of a project to allow for participation. Looking at some of these concepts from the smaller scale to the larger scale of the city, and transforming the edges of roads and the relationship of buildings to those edges. And here this diagram is a simple diagram from my notebooks, but you'll see that there are fixed elements, there are changeable elements, and there's negotiation between people in the built environment around those changeable elements. So we operate in different contexts. Currently, a project we're working on is in a rural area where we are very much designing it with an open building perspective, looking at not only having change within the different parts of this building, allowing for multiple interpretations of the building through its lifetime, allowing it to operate as one single family home or multiple homes, depending on changing family circumstances. So this is a project that's currently in process. And one of the things, I'm not going to read all of this, but one of the things about this project is we've had to really think very carefully about the ego of the architect, where as architects, we feel like we want to do certain things, but we have to be very respectful. And the family very specifically said they do not want to stand out in the neighborhood as having the odd house. So that's something that, keeping architectural egos in check is something that I think is very important. These are the contexts we many times operate in through our community engagement work. And these are the methods that we employ in reaching decisions in those contexts. And I'm going to conclude, as I always do, by suggesting that we reimagine, and here I'm talking about the African city specifically, reimagining it as a livable city, equitable, beautiful, functional, having diverse opportunities, offering people a chance at improving their lives and livelihoods, and also reimagining the African city as a lovable city, resonating with many people over many years, accommodating and embracing diversity, choice, and change, embedded in context in terms of culture and climate. And that is actually my last slide. Thank you so much to the organizers.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Denise. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I want to thank you for this invitation, and I would like to thank Professor Amir for inviting both of us to write in her wonderful book, the book she edited, called City, Space, and Power. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about that article here. And I would also, I don't want to pass this moment to also thank Professora Marinela Machado Araújo from Pontificia Universidad Católica of Minas Gerais, because she was the one that introduced us. And as always, she is a great facilitator. She is always building bridges. And I'm going to talk about the theory of encryption of power. And it's a theory I've been working on since 2010. As you have heard before, it is explicited in several of my books, published with Roman and Littlefield, and in the article in the book that Amir Ozman edited in South Africa. And if you want to look for it, there is also, it's actually the only article I have published in Portuguese with Professora Marinela Machado Araújo in a dossier that PUC published on the topic. So I'm talking about the theory of encryption of power, or the city, or rather the process of urbanization. When Amir and Denise invited me to talk about this, I felt like a fish out of the water. And here a disclaimer is timely, because I am not an urban planner. I am not an architect. I am a lawyer by profession and a philosopher by vocation. And so I felt very strange talking about the city. But then when I began to research and I began to feel what the theory of encryption of power could say about the city, I began to feel like that character from Molière, Monsieur Chopin, who always spoke in prose but never realized it. So it was the city. In a way, the theory of encryption always breathed the city, understood itself through the city, and I'm going to try to make that evident. First, I'm going to put forth a hypothesis of work connecting the theory of encryption of power with the urban process, and then I'm going to put forth a method in which the urban process can be understood by the theory of encryption of power. So what I understood from my work is that the city is at the forefront of the fashioning of the central political categories of our time. It is then not an object, but an all-encompassing tendency, sort of a dispositional category, a counter-movement from the nation state, and the primordial tactic of capital and coloniality that decides the outcome of power in the last 200 years. in that sense, what I perceived through the theory of encryption of power is that modernity, well, came to fruition, and it became a mold and a matrix of power through the nation state. But there has been a transformation in the last 200 years, making the city, and especially the process of urbanization, a new model of power. I'm going to try to explain that to you as close as I can. And this has to do with, first, the tactics of capitalism, of how capitalism has found in the city the way to coalesce all the powers of oppression, of dispossession, through law and through aesthetic measures, and what the theory of encryption can tell us from that. But also I want to put forth the thesis that the encryption of power, and I will explain to you as best as I can, given the time constraints, that the theory of encryption of power is the essence of coloniality. And what defines coloniality exists because it encrypts. So we have several movements here. First, that the city is the tactic of capitalism. Capitalism not only has come to fruition, but it has sophisticated itself because of an urbanizing process. But capitalism is germane to coloniality. There would be no capitalism without coloniality. And what determines the concept of coloniality is encryption of power. I know it still sounds very abstract. I'm going to try to pin it down as best as I can. In that sense, the second part I want to address is, what is the method? What is encryption of power? And the question here is the process of urbanization the quintessential form of encryption of power? And we arrive here through Lefebvre hypotheses rejuvenated by David Harvey, that what determines the outcome of capitalism in the last 200 years is a process of the urban, or capitalism driving everything into the urban space, concentrating it into the urban space. And what would have decrypted, if I'm talking about the encryption of power, of course, the method here is, what would we see, what would we find if we decrypt the city? What kind of subject would the city be? What kind of agency would we find? And would we talk about citizens, for example? So let me begin on what is encryption. What is the theory of encryption of power? In its most acute sense, I'm gonna put forth a definition in its most, if you want, pure, encapsulated state. The encryption of power is organized and concealed violence designed to neutralize, if not destroy, democracy in its own name, and thus to simulate the true dimensions of the world. How do we get there? How do I get there? There's a conventional definition of encryption as such, encryption of messages, which is something that is at plain sight. But we cannot see, we can see it, but we do not understand it. So it's a message that is transferred using Amir's language, transferred between two speakers that hold the keys to decrypt, but anyone who sees the message without that, without the signs of encryption, without the way to decrypt, will not understand it. In architectural terms, decrypt, the idea of decrypt as a physical thing, conceals a dead body while being a site of reverence to it. The body becomes sublimed in stone as representation of a soul that is elusive, as it is only itself a representation of a body that lays hidden. The body is not non-functional object, a non-object. It is, in the terminology of Heidegger, a present at hand that gets enshrined through an artifact that stands in its place as a symbol. The crypt is always void of content, other than being a chain of representation that ends up in a pulp quasi-object, a division of life and death. So in that sense, the marks of encryption are representation, adoration, hiddenness, and that is what turns on the crypt. Now, the theory of encryption of power goes deeper, and it is the encryption of power. So what is the encryption of power? I think the theory as such is a conceptual weapon proper to political philosophy, and it brings to the ground something unique. And this is what it proposes. This is in a nutshell. The orders of globalization through the hegemony of capitalism based on coloniality exist as a whole because they produce a specific form of power, a form of power that has only existed within these networks, within this history. The said form of power is encryption. What is encryption? When we face the encryption of power, and this I want to make it clear, encryption only exists in coloniality. It is the most sophisticated form of oppression of power. And we can find it, and where we will see it in its most acute sense is in the process of urbanization. And what is it finally? It's a primordial prohibition. It's a political, legal, racial prohibition to access the programming and the uses of communication. That's the first common difference. So what does encryption do? It permanently qualifies and conditions the exercise of power. And therefore, it is a rigid stratification of the belonging to any possible world. And so what encryption holds is that there can only be a world when it is the result of every being that produces difference. In that sense, what the theory of encryption holds is that there can only be a world, we can only talk of a world, of truly existent world, when it is the creation of all difference, of all beings that produce difference. And this is the basic point, with no qualification at all, and no finality beyond difference itself. And here we have to consider power. What is power for the theory of encryption of power? So power, the idea of power that the theory feeds on, is taken from a long tradition of the theory of philosophy of difference that swerves in between Heraclitus, Aristotle, Spinoza, Buber, Deleuze, Fanon, Jean-Luc Nancy. And the basic theory is fundamentally that to exist, is to exercise power. In that sense, power is, as Michel Foucault taught us, is not only the grand schemes of organized and systematic power as the state, as an army. When you think of power, you think of nation states, of war. What this other variant of philosophy, which comes from some from the Caribbean, some from the African diaspora that connects with Spinoza and Heraclitus, what they are telling us is to exist, is exercising power. In that sense, a hug, a bomb, a law, a bullet, a song are all expressions of power in the sense that they alter the conditions of possibility and recognition of beings. But of course, the main, beginning from that, what we arrive at is that the main issue of power is deciding who counts, deciding who can speak, deciding who can be. So in that sense, we understand that encryption sees the world. The theory of encryption understands that those great schemes of power, those systems of power, what they do is qualify beings. They stratify beings. So if those beings are not assimilated or are not similar to the model, then they do not belong. Then they can be chewed away. Then they can be disposed of. So encryption also finds a correlation, a very close correlation between law and the market. So law puts forth a lot of guarantees and safeguards. We the people of human rights, all men and women and whatever. But then, according to the needs of the market, it expels people to be rumpled up, to be trampled up by the market. In that sense, there are two definitions of power theory works with. One is potentia, and this is from Aristotle. It's a very complex theory, but I'm going to try to put it a little bit more specifically and to understand what the city has to do with this and the urban process. Potentia is when power, any organization, any way of talking, any discourse, any good is determined with no distinction and no finality at all. That means when everyone immanently can produce itself, can pronounce itself, can be in the world, while potestas is the operation of absorbing multiplicity of power, its abundance, the abundance of difference, into structures of uniformity. And what they do in those structures of uniformity, you can call those structures of uniformity the Constitution, you can call it race, the racial compound, the gender compound, all those grand ideas as democracy. What they do is that they determine that in order to belong to the model, you must be in a certain way. You must have a certain semblance to the model, or else you will be spitted out. So when is there encryption? Encryption is basically a qualifying of life, a qualifying of being, a qualifying of power, a qualifying of life that establishes what? That imposes harsh conditions as well as finalities on the exercise of power. And those are the main pipelines of encryption. And what does that mean in practical terms? That basically, and what encryption does is a very rigorous and very stringent research of Western, not only philosophy, but what I have called the disciplines of obedience. Disciplines of obedience such as not only philosophy, but specifically law. And what I found in those works and in my books is that there is a tendency in those disciplines of obedience to establish transcendent models. And what is the role of transcendent models? To dictate from vanishing point of invisibility that is outside language and any relation of power, the conditions to which every being and every form of beingness must abide in order to be. In that sense, think of those great words, of those great structures, of those great institutions, law, the Constitution, the idea of homeland, the idea of nation, the idea of race, the idea of rights, and then you have transcendent models. What transcendent models determine is a cutting line of who belongs within the community, who belongs within the city, the polis, and that's the difference that is grabbed, the difference from the Greeks from politeia, from politeiuma. Politeia is the basic wound of politics. It is the question of who counts, who can be included, who can speak, who can perform its own identity. And from the Greeks, from the Socratic dialogues from Plato, when the question is put to Socrates, who belongs to the city, Socrates puts it forward, and that's what has prevailed, and that's what has pervaded the Western disciplines of obedience is only the virtuous man. Of course, virtue, the question is, what is virtue? Is it a universal stand? Can we prove virtue as we prove ideally that every triangle has 3 angles, or that every metal dilates with heat? Of course not. So what we find is that there is always a condition to belong to the body politic, a condition that is outside beingness, that it doesn't depend on being, doesn't depend on breathing, and doesn't depend on becoming, but it depends on someone who has, from Socrates, kidnapped the concept of belonging. On the other side, in the Platonic dialogues, Protagoras, when he is asked who belongs to the body politic, he answers everyone without any further condition. And so that is the idea of encryption. When is there encryption? When there are conditions to belong. Where are those conditions? Those conditions are established by a model. But the point is that that model always remains hidden. And it remains hidden in several ways. But then I am speaking, or I'm trying to demonstrate that encryption is germane, is proper to coloniality. In what sense? And then I bring forth the concept of the hidden people. And basically put, again, in a nutshell, and we can discuss this further, and I'm trying to cramp, my books in this presentation that is also, of course, in the article written for Space and Power, the book edited by Amir with the collaboration of Denise. The idea is basically what marks our late form of coloniality, beginning with the constitutional phenomenon, is the creation of a hidden people. So what we have, or what I have lately come to call the people as a synecdoche. So on one side, and this is very proper to power in power as potestas, that means power as oppression, power as exclusion, and this is where it all happens, is the city and the process of urbanization. So on one side, we have the people of the grand and mega eloquent declarations of human rights and the modern constitutions. There is no modern constitution as an ideological machine that is very closely knit with power, that does not declare that the sovereign are the people. So on one side, we have the people as a totality, the we the people, the we who belong. But on the other side, what the theory discovers is that there is an excrement, there is an outer side, the people that are hidden, the people that do not belong. Think of it in terms of migration. So on one side, we, the French people, the French citizen, belonging to a model which is heteropatriarchal, that is patriarchy at its best, which is an owner, the owner of property, who is supposedly cultivated in the arts of Western knowledge. And on the other side, we have its hidden outside, which is the migrant, the African, the Latin American, who does not belong within the classification, the denomination of the citizen of those constitutions. Now, what the theory finds is that this is not a minor accident in modernity. This is not something that it simply happens as a kind of a collateral effect. This is the shape of modernity. This is the shape of coloniality. It is its very essence. The idea that there is a people as a totality, because what power does and what sovereignty does is count heads. So the basis of power is fundamentally establishing, here are the people that are a totality. Of course, that totality is nothing but an ideal. Of course, that totality is nothing but a violent imposition of who counts and for what it counts. And on the other side, you have what is outside the totality, but however, that outside, that excrement, is what defines the totality. It is the element without which the totality could not exist. It is its very method of representation. So it is not only an accounting method, power counts. Power has counting methods, or methods to count heads. Who counts, who doesn't count. The element that defines encryption in our times is that division between the people as totality and the hidden people as its underbelly, as the dark side, what cannot be seen. It is in Colombia the indigenous. It is in Colombia the violence against the body of the women. And where does that take place? I found, or I propose as a hypothesis in the article, in a process of urbanization. Because first you had the great nation states, and the idea of the nation state was the model, was the mold by which the Western powers could subdue and colonize the rest of the world, impose their knowledge, impose their understanding of the world, impose the model of man. But now it is done in the city. The city has basically become a huge ideological concentration camp where capitalism exploits ideologically and it exploits racially. So the point here is that we have sovereignty in its most elemental conception as drawn up by Hobbes and Baudin in the 16th and 17th century, but also by Schmitt and Agamben in the 20th century, as the idea that sovereignty is the act of who defines the rules of the game. What is the supreme autonomous absolute power to define reality? But what Agamben and Schmitt, or Schmitt and Agamben, not to be anachronic, put there is that the sovereign is who decides on the exception through the exception. So the sovereign is standing in the exceptional. What is the exceptional? The origin of power, where there is no meaning yet, where there is no possibility of rules yet, and standing there defines the exception. What the theory of encryption of power finds, and this is the knot that determines that only encryption as we have thought it works in coloniality, or why encryption is the very form of coloniality, is that through the constitutions and through the establishment of the city as a new wave of organizing space, of organizing senses, of organizing people, only in this late coloniality, this happens, which is magic. It is an act of brilliance on behalf of power, is that it makes the people the sovereign. But those people they make the sovereign are immediately expelled to the exception. So no system has ever made the people the sovereign. Imagine this, you make the slave the sovereign. You make the people you want to dispossess the sovereign. So you kill them, dispossess them, you forcibly move them in their own name, in their own good. This is not only a huge ideological apparatus, but it is a logical apparatus. That is the way you determine that. I have given myself now a new work is to write. I just wrote my second novel, and of course there are transitions and spaces there between my philosophical work and my novel. And I have like 3 minutes. I want to read a part of the novel. And this part of the novel is Medellin, Colombia in the 1980s. A rich kid is mingling with a poor kid, and the poor kid takes him to his neighborhood. And he says this to the rich kid. I'm going to finish this with this. You people, I translated it into English. You people need us to bleed far from you so as not to soil your streets. But if you bleed over there, it is up to us to clean it up. You want us to kill each other and at the same time paint your houses. Pack up your groceries and patch up your streets. You people want us locked up here, but you can't live without us. You want us literate, but respectful to you. You want us hungry, but strong enough to raise your buildings. You want us abnormals to maintain the balance of your normality. You people don't even want to look this way because we are the ugliness of your souls, but you spend millions to count us, diagnose us, model us, but for what? So you can lock us up in plain sight, so you can keep your consciences clear and hands tidy. Your people are an animal that sheds its skin when it wants to. You are the criminals who use the worst forms of violence to take everything from us, to drain our bodies. But when we protest, you raise the wall of the law. And those you cannot drain with one form of violence, you drain with the other. One bloody hand washes the other. Progress for you is death for us. The mythical fear you have is that these black masses of men descend on you like zombies, and we cut your throats and rape your women. From that fear, the whole dirty wheel of political corruption turns, and with that fear sown deeply in your war industry, in you, the war industry flourishes without anyone wondering how or why, when in reality, your worst enemies are among yourselves. You are the ones who fuck and steal and betray and keep each other in perpetual fear. What you do not see is that when we set foot in your city, everything is marked with prohibition signs for us, each one ordering us where we can walk, how we can walk, when we can raise our heads, when we have to greet, and how we have to answer. While you see tennis courts and shopping malls, hamburgers and highways, we see stop and go signs, lanes with red chalk, marking the ground, intimidation coming out of everything, death threats, police everywhere, police in the missus who grabs the child by the hand so that he does not stay close to us, policemen and the attendant who follows us throughout the store with radios in their hands, here among the open sewers. I'm sorry, there was a point. Here among the open sewers and the quagmire of life, politicians march promising water and electricity, and then they disappear. And then you people ask why it is that we want everything for free. Why don't we do anything for ourselves? But then when we organize and start mobilizing, really mobilizing, they like that less than anything. And so they start killing us like flies. They want us poor and disorganized to be able to say that poverty is our fault and that your wealth is deserved and worked for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ricardo. I'm going to speak in Portuguese since we have the translation. The last time when I spoke in English, it seems like they didn't get the translation. Well, we are here trying to understand this technology. So I think it would be better for me to speak in Portuguese. And I'm going to ask Professor Amira to connect to the English translation. And if you can open your camera, Professor Amira. I'd really like to thank Professor Ricardo for his speech. And just like I also thanked Professor Amira, even though you are not an architect, you bring us the possibility of understanding so you bring the opportunity of helping us from the point of view of architecture to understand what I call exclusion, a system of exclusion in the production of contemporary cities. I'd like first to start with this because even though here with the two seminars, we have a point of view that is very critical in relation to architecture. And on the other hand, a point of view that is very critical in relation to law. We have in common the following point, which is how cities are produced. And if on the one hand, we architects, or at least a small part of the architectural profession are trying to recognize the voice and recognize who in fact is a citizen, who can actually speak, who should speak, who needs to speak. And this is our work that we would like to synthesize through what we're trying to do, something that we call open building. It's not reduced to open building, but a good part of it is there in the sense of the project. On the other hand, we have issues regarding law, regarding access to law, in understanding, in the communication. So it seems to me that we have a lot in common. These two areas that seem so distinct from one another, on the one hand, and I'm talking about architecture and law. On the other hand, if you understand this city as the basis through which capitalism inevitably installs itself, based on this understanding, we can have a series of points in common, which makes us understand and think that it is possible to bring some other kind of practice, some other kind of possibility of rupture with the so-called obedience disciplines, as Professor Ricardo mentioned so well. On the other hand, we had the possibility of decrypting the city so that we are able to find something else which is still unknown to us, either because we don't want to see it or because we're not capable of seeing it, which in the case of architecture seems to me much more this issue of our lack of capacity of giving voice to those who need it, our lack of capacity to recognize the city as a whole. So basically to say that we have a lot in common. Once again, we speak the same language, as I mentioned before. And we have some questions here. The questions, well, I'm going to be asking them slowly. And I'll start with a question for Amira. 2 questions from Professor Marcelo Galupo. I'm sorry if I pronounced the last name wrong. Who asks you, Professor Amira, if you know the work of Paulo Freire. I'm sure that I like to anticipate that you do know Paulo Freire for sure. But he asks you if you know Paulo Freire and the ideas of education and the connections that are established with your critique in relation to transformation and transfer. And his other question is that he thinks open building is a very interesting concept, but it reminds him of a concept that we have here in Brazil, which is a word called puxadinho. What does that mean? It's like a small extension of a larger building. And this sense of this word, puxadinho, is the way in which the favelas and the slums are developed here in Brazil. So he wants a little, he wants you to answer those questions. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Prof. Denise, and thank you to the prof that asked the questions. Yes, I very deliberately, I hope you can hear me clearly, I very deliberately tried to capture the concepts that I write about, and Paulo Freire is one of the references that I use, one of the sources that I use. So that's why in my presentation, I was trying to direct people actually to my writing, because there, what Ricardo tried to do, he said, is to put all of his books in a few minutes. And I think I was doing something similar in trying to put quite a lot of work very concisely. So yes, absolutely. The book, I think the whole book is quite interesting. It's educating citizen designers in South Africa. And yes, I think all of the chapters are interesting, but in my particular chapter, I use various sources, various philosophies, and that is definitely one of the resources that I use. The way that open building is being described by the person asking the question seems to me, and I might be mistaken, but it seems to me it's almost like it's being understood as a core building, and it is not. And if I had done a broader presentation on open building, one of my main slides is the famous Habraken image where a frame building is being crossed out and it says this is not an open building. And also a quote, or not a quote, but a statement that I often make, that an open building is not an incomplete building. So there's a lot of assumptions around open building. An open building is a lot, it has a lot of deep meanings. And actually, as I was listening to Ricardo, and Ricardo says he's not an architect, he's not in a built environment. But I don't believe we can change practice if we don't change our thinking. And that's why, for me, what Ricardo is doing is so incredibly crucial for the development of our own thinking as designers. I'm not as poetic as Ricardo is, but I take what Ricardo and others say very seriously, and I translate that into a language that I understand and into my practice and in my design and in my teaching. And so, Ricardo, I just want to say that the role you're playing is crucial. Now, what does this have to do with the second question around open building? Open building is a philosophy. It really is an incredibly deep and beautiful philosophy around how we understand the world and the built environment and the relationships between people and how they work together and collaborate together and inhabit the same city together. It's a way of thinking. It is a philosophy. So for the person that asked the question, I would just like to say that I'm definitely not making reference to a core building that expands and develops. I'm not making reference to a framework that is incomplete, not at all. I hope that explains, and maybe there'll be opportunities for further engagement on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amira. I'd like to indicate to Professor Marcelo on our website, the praxis.arq.ufmg.br. There's research, there's a publication on open buildings, which explains conceptually, theoretically, this concept, and joint publications of ours, dissertations, theses. It would be great for you to check it out. So these initial questions about these concepts that subsidize the open building, it's an invitation to you. Another question for you, Ricardo. First, could you speak a bit on contemporary coloniality, differences in terms of the restricted concept of coloniality and the discussion that is placed in contemporaneous terms? And the second question is in terms of the abstract concepts of liberty and citizenship. How do they impact the inequitable access to rights?
Let me put this in English. Yes, those are very interesting questions, and they determine what encryption is about. The transit from colonialism to coloniality, and from there to late coloniality, and this is something I've been discussing, for example, with Walter Mignolo, is I always put the example, you want to see colonialism as, it's very basic. Colonialism, it's invasion, it's control. Of course, colonialism as the form of the world, of the modern world, only happens with Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. It only happens with the overflow of Spain and Portugal and then Western Europe, as the way of the world, imposing a form of knowledge that is reluctant to any critique, based on the idea of rationality and imposing epistemological and aesthetical models that supposedly come from a scientific method. So there is no opposing this. And still, coloniality inherits the brutality and the violence of colonialism, but it becomes much more sophisticated. And much more sophisticated in what sense? I always describe this, that Spain and Portugal understood the world as a church. And through a theological apparatus, it tried to conquer, evangelize the world. With the coming into scene of Britain and then France, the world was seen as an open market. And the Netherlands, of course, was seen as an open market. But coloniality is much more pervasive. As Nelson Maldonado teaches us, it's in the way we talk. It's in the way we apprise aesthetics. It's in the way we understand hierarchies. When I'm talking encryption, our systems of hierarchy, I'm saying it's not only the law that hierarchizes, it's us. We put the world through the funnel of aesthetical, epistemological hierarchies, music, the idea of beauty, the idea of generosity. So, and the new way of coloniality, where encryption, I think, finds its grounding, it's, for my interest, in the idea of the Constitution. But the Constitution is only an example of how the world begins to work. And so the late coloniality, the point in late coloniality is that the people that are hidden, the people that are brutalized, the people that are excluded from the city, the people that drown in the Mediterranean, the people that are ostracized in their own city and put into ghettos, are the people that have become magically, however mysteriously, the sovereign. So it's a simulated sovereign. So the concept of simulacrum, of simulacra, is vital to understand that late coloniality. And what has changed in the national state, think of the national state in the 19th century, invading, think of the Berlin Conference of the European countries, carving up Africa. I'm going to keep this through this river and we're going to create this. Now, it's much more sophisticated. It all happens in the city. Think of financiarization. You have a guy now in the city of London trying to play the futures market, trying to buy the future, try to establish what the future would look like. With a click of his computer, suddenly the Amazon can disappear. A city is turned into a hellhole. So coloniality there is a new dimension of coloniality. It's stronger. It hasn't dissipated. It hasn't evaporated. All the contrary, it has spread. I have this theoretical discussion, because people, the likes of Michael Hart and Tony Negri, they, in some sense, empire through Commonwealth and the multitude. The idea is that sovereignty has vanished. It has become vaporous. It is not enough to kill the king and invade the city. It is everywhere. But they think that sovereignty has transformed into something else. I hold that it hasn't. I understand the transformation, but we still need the police in the Mediterranean. We still need the customs. We still need the police force in the cities, the brutality to tear down slums. And the point is that sovereignty still exists. And the basic point here is that it still exists as a way to determine the hidden people, as a way to determine who can die, as a way to determine, but not only who can die, but in whose name. Before, you kill the people in the name of God. You kill people or displace them in the name of the king, in the name of a race, in the name of a nation. Now you kill them in their own name, in the name of democracy. Now, what the theory of encryption, and this, for the second question, I would recommend the reading of Max Stirner, a very little known philosopher that was contemporaneous of Hegel, even a friend of Hegel. And what the theory of encryption understands is that any model, be it called liberty, those grand words, what Lyotard called the great narratives, always hide something perverse. And that perverseness is that you must, any being, discreet as it may be, think of the tea sellers that Amira was talking. Think of the billions of people living on the fringes of poverty, trying to make ends meet, trying not to die of hunger today. You know, we prefer to sacrifice them in the name of liberty, in the name of democracy, in the name of justice. Those are simply words. But are words that are a minefield, are words that from where elites can determine the shape of the world and their exclusion, can determine their obliteration. I mean, we have a world today where children are put in cages, but that is okay in the name of the nation state. That is okay in the name of the citizen. That is okay in the name of democracy. So what encryption goes to is another type of philosophy, a philosophy embedded in the other. And you can find that philosophy from the works of Jewish philosophers and from two African ways of life like Ubuntu. And what is that base of philosophy? Is anything can be encrypted. So when you think of the world, whatever it is that makes up the world, any discourse, any being in the city, walk through the city, what are the prohibited, you know, there are places people cannot go into. You know, who can go into a shopping? I remember in Rio, shopping Leblon. Who can go into shopping Leblon? And inside they have even more stringent limits. The idea is every time you see a discourse, a building, a reality, a relation, a machine, ask yourself who can have access to it, who can announce itself in it, who will benefit from it, who can determine its fate. And then you understand what encryption is, I think. I don't know if I make myself clear. So the basis of encryption is the other, and not any other, the other that is excluded. But that other is excluded in the name of grand schemes and grand discourses. What the theory, you know, tries to bring down and to tear the veil of those great structures to see what is behind them.
Thank you, Professor Ricardo. Amira, we have 2 more questions for you, and then also some more for Ricardo. Are you there, Professor? Amira? Okay. The question from Rodrigo Rocha is, what are the limits that you find in architecture as a discipline in your practice? And what are the bridges that you build with other disciplines to build more inclusive cities? And Cynthia Braulio would like to ask you whether or up to what extent the approach and anti-racist approaches and actions can act in de-encrypting cities. Do you have any practical experiences to share in that sense?
Thank you so much. Thanks again for the questions, and thanks again to Ricardo. I wrote in the notes, and I hope, Ricardo, that you saw that when you read a part of your novel, it reminds me of apartheid cities where Blacks are not considered, or were not considered, to be a part of the city, yet they needed to be close enough to serve the city and to maintain a particular lifestyle. So your novel really resonated. And also something that you said that reminds me of a quote about private space in South Africa often being disguised as public space. So as soon as someone that is perceived as other enters that space, a security person will show up. So Ricardo, thank you for helping me see those connections and giving voice to those kind of concerns. So the questions, what are the limits of architecture as a discipline? I think one of the key things, and I hope it emerged strongly in my presentation, is that I really critique the interpretation of architecture as currently presented to us, as currently defined. And that's why I focus so much on my presentation on regulatory authorities. I believe that the institutions and the councils that regulate our professions are incredibly important, have an incredibly important role in reformulating and reinterpreting what architecture is about. And so it's both a question of what are the limits of the discipline and how can we work with other disciplines in the transformation of cities. But just to give you one example for the person that asked this question, a lot of African practices are spatial in nature. I argue they are architectural, but they are not necessarily reflected in built form. They're reflected in how people occupy open space, as an example. But conventional architectural history does not consider that as architecture. So those kind of spatial practices, which are incredibly important, are not captured in any of our formal history books. So our education systems and the way that we document architecture and architectural practice needs to change in major ways for such spatial practices to be documented and acknowledged in academia. The other thing is there's many, and I don't think it just relates to architecture. I think more and more disciplines are having to merge and work together for any kind of innovation or effectiveness or relevance to be achieved. So in my work with some of my doctoral students, I'm currently, as an example, for this particular person that asked the question, I'm supervising a doctoral dissertation with the business school. I'm working with the Faculty of Science. And I'm working with the industrial design department, and that's the only way that we can address many of the questions facing our cities. So in terms of practical experiences in the decryption of cities, I think I've hinted a lot in my own language. I believe that Ricardo and I share similar concerns and similar values and similar ideas around cities. But I said earlier, I don't think I'm as poetic as Ricardo. But in my presentation, I've made numerous references to how even at site level, we can have an impact on if your building relates in a different way to the street. If the building is built using particular forms of labor or particular technologies that don't need heavy machinery, that are labor intensive, in those ways you start those small site interventions start having really significant transformational capacity. That is my argument, and that's how I believe it then leads to these ideas and contributing towards the decryption. So I hope that that answers the question, and I think a lot of my presentation actually hinted at that. Thank you.
All right, certainly. Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. So, and I have two questions for Professor Ricardo. Beyond decrypting the city, this is a question from Thiago Canetieri. Beyond decrypting the city, Is it possible to decrypt architecture? Architecture is a regime of power and of visibility connected to modernity. If we decrypt architecture, what will we see behind this? And I'm going to make a brief parenthesis here. I'd like to mention self-construction or construction in popular territories. It is responsible for 80% of the housing provision in Brazil. In my way of seeing it, in a completely encrypted way, I'd like to ask you if you agree that this is the encryption of architecture. And the second question, do you want to answer the first one or should I go to the second one? Okay. The second question has the same sort of path in the sense of understanding how we architects and civil society can try and de-encrypt power and turn people's exclusive reality. And Julia Lade also mentions the philosopher Adela Cortina. I don't know if you know her. She created the term apeirophobia, which is the rejection and aversion to poor people. She proposes a series of reforms to overcome this rejection against poor people, apeirophobia, through education, the elimination of inequality, the promotion of democracy, so on and so forth. Do you agree with this, or do you have another way of looking at it? Thank you.
Put in English. About sight. It's a regime of seeing, of feeling. Above all, ideology is a question of effects. So when we talk about the Constitution, for example, or when we talk about the city, it is what we feel through them, what we understand we are within them. In that sense, the cities are the most highly encrypted spaces I can think. You think of Rio, you think of New York, but you think of Bogota. It is a map of prohibitions. It is a map of legalization, of oppression, of legalization of an ideology that keeps it like this. I think there are many examples, not to go far from, what our surroundings are. What Praxis is doing is decrypting the city, but not far from UFMG is PUC, and there is NUJUPI, the núcleo, I always forget the name in Portuguese, Núcleo Urbano de Políticas, directed by Marinella. They have been working on decrypting the city and decrypting a law for a long time. Those are examples of encryption, of decryption. But how do you decrypt? Finally, the question that I wrote down here is how do you decrypt? You decrypt by finally getting to the point to understand that whatever you see or you inhabit, when you're inhabiting this gorgeous shopping center, when you're inhabiting this beautiful neighborhood, there is an example in Medellin where they built a beautiful condominium in a place where the wind maintained the city fresh. Medellin is in a deep valley. They build it on top so the wind doesn't go by. They stole the wind. They stole the wind from people. This is encryption, and this is not understanding the integration of nature to, well, that's another discussion for architects, but it's the point. But the point of encryption is whatever you see, a method, a discourse, a building, a space, you ask who fits in here, who can live here, and who does it depend on? Now for the World Cup, on whose lacerated back, on whose poverty is this wealth riding on? And decrypting architecture would be very interesting because etymologically, and etymology, carries everything. Again, we feel through etymology. We place ourselves in the world within the words that have those pervasive and deep cut meaning. Architecture means principle. Principle, it's architect is who builds the model, the principle, the idea. And again, decryption, what recognizes in principles and ideas is that there is always something hidden. There is someone who determines the principle that is hidden from sight, that determines what the world is going to be without giving any word to the world. So all in those grand schemes of democracy, of liberty, there are principles. Those are the principles, but they are hidden universals that determine from very precarious, very short-lived, small, peripheric forms of understanding language and the world, but violently impose the principle, violently impose what the world has to mean. I don't know if that answers. So yes, it is a necessity to decrypt architecture, beginning by its etymological compound, and then to ask itself why architecture is so modern. It's a way of power. You know, space, establishing the relation of space and time and population, and who can enter a building and who can exit and who can see it even, is an act, essentially is an act of power. It's essentially an act of depriving voices, of establishing who counts and who doesn't count. There is no better way than determining what space is. I always ask my students, this is just a therapeutic or even a didactic exercise, is put yourself in the place of an alien. You know, an alien who just steps down a spaceship and goes and sees. What shock can he see, seeing that there are beaches only in my book I put it, you know, a beach in Rio de Janeiro could be closer to someone living in Stockholm than someone living in one of the favelas. So the relativization of time-space that architecture does is huge. So architecture allows us not to see the world as a plain thing, bidimensional thing, Cartesian thing, but a multiple thing, you know, a very complex thing that feeds on the energy of space and time and evolves to it and gives us a sense of reality, of a very intricate relation of space and time, which is basically an act of power. And there is no other act of power more important than determining who can, who counts, who is. And aporophobia, yes, I think aporophobia is a very strong concept because it also bends and relativizes and in a very timely way all the discussion of class, for example. But I would wager, I would like you know, to discuss that in terms of the hidden people, because I think, and again, I'm sorry if I'm planting laurels in my head that I shouldn't, but I think hidden people is a stronger concept in the sense that it is more technical. And being more technical, it is at the same time poetical, in the sense that it is versatile. It is versatile because hidden people is an elastic, plastic figure. It is not written in stone. It is not rigid. It is not solid. It is always transforming. And precisely the power, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, the power of the encryptor, that is the power of the elites, is the power to establish who counts and who doesn't count, not in a rigid way, as Bruno Latour told us. And Bruno Latour, I have made this in a kind of metaphor. Sovereignty is like an app, artificial intelligence. Sovereignty you don't need sovereignty to act in every space, in every time, in every way, in every moment. You just need a way to determine what is going to happen. So I feed in this artificial intelligence app called sovereignty. What is the place of Denise, for example, or what is the place of the tea worker in the world, and it establishes it. It establishes perfectly what is the place. So one of the things that the encryptor does, who holds sovereignty, who holds effectively the keys of encryption, is that it can determine to its will who belongs and who doesn't belong, but not according to a rigid model, but according to the occurrence of the event in the moment. That is to say that it is very elastic in doing so. And it's always post. So an act that today is deemed as completely anti-democratic, but then we have an analogy of another country. You know, if my country invades your country, is for democracy. But then sovereignty allows, and all the construction of the encryption allows for 2 months later, if another country that I don't like invades another country, that's terrorism. I don't know if I make myself clear. So I think the concepts of encryption are more elastic, I believe, but that is, of course, open for discussion.
Thank you, Professor Ricardo. Amira, sometimes I call you professors, we're friends, I forget about formalities. It's hard to maintain formalities when we're so close. Well, I'd like to thank, I see that I'm just checking questions, but it seems to be that we've gone through all the questions. So I'd like to invite everyone to be a part of the second day of our meeting that will be next Monday, which will be mediated by Dr. Cleide Nepomuceno from the Justice System of Minas Gerais. It's really important that our partners are present in our discussions, and we will dedicate the session to the exercise of politics with the presentation of 3 works by Bruno Fernandes Lima, Thais Nassif, and Carolina Almeida. It will be a very interesting discussion. And I'd like to thank you if you want to have your closing considerations, Professors Amira and Ricardo. So any last considerations, closing thoughts?
I can definitely just say thank you. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. There's a lot that we can discuss. Denise and I'm quite comfortable using first names. We've worked a lot together and we've known each other for years. And for me, when we embarked on the book project, when we produced that book together, I could see that it was really going to be the start of a conversation. So for me, this forum today has been another step in that conversation, and I'm looking forward to many more. There's an issue around open building that I would love to have unpacked in another session that we can plan in the future, because open building in principle, you spoke about auto-construction, and open building does rely on a level of control and a level of authority that is balanced with individual decision-making and freedom. So it's not like 100% freedom. And that is one thing that I've often grappled with in my teaching, in my writing, in my work, because it really relies on that balance. And, and having to relate that to Ricardo's theories around the decryption of the city and so on. So I'd love for that to, I'm putting this forward, proposing it, that discussion around balancing those two aspects of freedom and control as being something we take forward in another conversation. But thank you. It has been wonderful to be with you in this platform. Thank you so much. And thanks to Ricardo as well. Thanks.
Just a little comment before I give you the floor, Ricardo. We have research at Praxis, Amir, talking specifically about self-construction through the lenses of open building. This discussion was, I was provoked into it in a really pleasant conversation and a deep conversation with Abraken a few years ago. And he really has provoked me in this sense for many years. So I hope you are a part of this discussion that we have initiated for many years ago. But now that we feel that we're more mature, we are able to propose effective paths in this alliance between self-construction, open building, and the support, let me say, theoretical and methodological support of Ricardo's encryption and disencryption theory. So to some people, it may sound as if this is an adventure, but I would say this is a transdisciplinary proposal. In the sense that we don't know how to do this yet, but we want to do things outside of the exclusivity of architecture. So this is something we're carrying out. I hope that I can share novel things and results soon. Ricardo, over to you.
In every sense, not only for inviting me here, which I think it's a vital space of discussion, but for the book and to belong to this discussion group that has really widened my horizons and opened my eyes to other realities I had not seen. Truly, when I began to think and see the city through the eyes of the invitation you made me, it changed the perspective of encryption. What I would say, just to wrap it up, would be that there is no, when we decrypt, there is no other reality. There is not a subjacent reality. It is not paradise lost. It is not like we are going to a purer origin of ourselves. I think the next article, I'm going to call it the city as the mirror of our soul. In that sense, when we look at the city and we decrypt, what we see is ourselves. And what do we see of ourselves? When we look at any mechanism of power, when we look at any representation of emblem of power, and the city is the most important representation of power, when we see it through those channels of encryption like race, nation, even democracy and justice, we do not see the truth of it, or the potentiality of it, or the capacity of it. So we have to see it, what we see through the encryption is basically the other that is excluded. So it is so important, the people that are present here in this discussion as those that are absent. The theory of encryption is based on the hidden people, and the hidden people is a very spiritual essence of those who are absent, those who are not here, but that make this in a way possible. So we see basically a mirror of our soul in that precise meaning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Amira. I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth in languages, but I think we've been successful in our technological battle. It wasn't easy, but thank you to the support of San Diego State University. I'd like to thank Simone and Diogo, who are our interpreters, and wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. All of those who were here watching us through the YouTube channels in both languages. And please save the dates for the next meetings on next Monday. We will be here for our second day of meetings of our seminar. Flavio, I'd ask you to wrap up. I'd like for you to remain here, and you can close off the YouTube session. Flavio, thank you, everyone.